Right. Liberty and rights or liberty versus rights? Thanks so much for tuning into Northern Vibe. If this is your first time tuning in, thanks for joining us on this journey to cultivate curiosity. We like to talk about things here that are controversial in a respectful way. So tonight's episode is an edit and a discussion around Sel Grover's interview that she had with the FTM trans guy and mate of mine, Kev Hine. We had a fantastic discussion on the impact of human rights and liberty. And without too much of a spoiler alert, we are wondering if these two things are mutually exclusive, and that's fundamentally what we talk about. But I know you don't want to hear from me. I know you want to hear from Sel and Kev and get into the discussion. So let's get into that right now. This one's only 15 minutes. Thanks so much for tuning in. How is it that the concept, dare I say, cloak or slogan of human rights is being used to crush liberty? How is it that the invocation of human rights are stifling free speech, preventing individual citizens to debate, to disagree, to associate, to play sport? Women can't even go to the toilet safe in the knowledge they'll crush liberty. During this discussion, we will answer the question, how did this happen? How is it that human rights became a weapon of oppression rather than an instrument of liberty? There are so many examples of how the invocation of rights is crushing the liberty of citizens to act in accordance with their worldviews and consciences. We're all familiar with the sports debates and toilets. So many birds have been killed with the human rights. How is it that human rights became a citizenship with the Love case, where it was held that citizenship as a concept doesn't really exist? The Australian Law Reform Commission's use of anti-discrimination laws to attack religious freedom and effectively define what is and is not acceptable religious belief and associated practice. The finding of Federal Court Justice Mortimer's decision in Wooten versus Queensland, where police were declared to be systematically racist, despite no evidence that the police response to the riots in Palm Island had anything to do with race, and all necessary due process was followed. In the name of rights and equity, Indigenous people are treated differently by courts, ostensibly for positive discrimination. Now with Tickle versus Giggle, the insanity of trans ideology has been legally validated. All the foundational principles of diversity, inclusion, and equity have been validated by high courts who are not subject to democratic correction. The case Tickle versus Giggle does get media attention, but not the amount of press attention it deserves. And it's almost always framed by the mainstream media as a positive vindication for progress, especially for trans rights. More and more people are hearing about this and starting to recognise the impact and importance of this case. I don't say this lightly, and I don't think it's hyperbole. This is the Mabo of human rights cases. And considering the international nature of human rights law, this Australian case will set a compelling precedent, definitely for Anglosphere countries and Western countries, but I suspect in the rest of the world. This is a big deal. Now, for those unaware of it, to give the briefest of backgrounds, Sel Grover, a magnificent millennial woman, returned to Australia after years in America after a successful career as a scriptwriter in Hollywood. She's smart, and I mean this only observationally for the purposes of context, beautiful, and consequently, she was subject to some real sexual abuse, genuine Me Too stuff from the predators in Hollywood. She returned home due to COVID visa changes, pretty scarred by her experience, as she told me in her interview. She started a female-only app, Giggle for Girls, designed to be an online female-only space to facilitate anything from finding accommodation through knitting circles, same-sex dating, whatever. A biological male who identifies as a woman named Roxy Tickle, no, seriously, joined the app, but once Sel saw Tickle's photo and recognised a biological male, Tickle was removed. Tickle made a complaint to the Federal Human Rights Commission. Sel refused to compromise, and the matter ended up in federal court. The case was named Giggle versus Tickle, rather than Grover versus Tickle, indicating someone at the court really does have a sense of humour. As a quick aside, Roxy Tickle isn't the only Australian who has a dissonance between their self-image and objective measurable reality. Recently, a biological female caused an international uproar when she identified and competed as a breakdancer at the Paris Olympics. But an Australian federal court recently ruled on self-definition, finding that legally speaking, a man can be a woman. But in his, and I hope I've used the judge's correct pronoun, writings, Justice Bromwich evaded the question of addressing the real issue, being, should the legal definition of woman have any link whatsoever with objective measurable reality? In his judgment, he specifically declined to answer that question. Now, I'm tempted to get all ironic here and make observations like, well, I suppose he's just a humble functionary interpreting the law, and the issue of the relationship between law and reality is too complex and above his pay grade. And after all, he is not a biologist. But I will say something unironically. It makes a very pleasant change not to have unelected judges interpreting words conveniently and thereby producing political policy. Like in the Love case, to pick a recent example, entirely at random. For what it's worth, he conveniently, one might argue, avoided the real issue. But I have to say, having read the entire judgment, I agree with his legal reasoning. For clarity, I'm not saying it's rational because he specifically avoided the question, should law be linked with reality? But his legal reasoning is sound and in line with the intentions of the legislation. That much is clear. Once you accept the axiom that this issue is not what is a woman, but is Tickle legally female, two different things, there is a high degree of internal consistency in the judge's judgment. But for me, reading this judgment answered the question, how is it that human rights legislation in institutions will be, in fact, must result in the crushing of civil liberties as we have conceived, known, and practiced up to this point at time? It's for a really simple reason. Human rights laws don't protect people, but immutable characteristics like race and assumed identities like gender. The Human Rights Commission does not see people as individual humans that happen to possess identity characteristics. It sees identity characteristics as possessing and therefore defining people. Because it's the identity characteristics that are protected by law, not the person, a regime founded on human rights believes it's both right and just if a person is severely punished to protect a characteristic. Just got to duck in and say thanks for all the likes and shares. Big g'day to you, Kev. Thanks for tuning in, and keep the comments up, everybody. Thank you so much. They see this as justice rather than its perversion. Common law systems are founded on a completely contrary conceptual framework. Instead, the axiomatic understanding of the common law system is that it's there to protect people and believes that characteristics, like a predisposition to steal, should be punished. Common law recognizes human characteristics, but does not assert that one or even a number of characteristics together define a person. For centuries since Magna Carta, there have been protection and rights woven into law and practice for every individual alleged to have been a criminal. But those protections and those practices are based on Western Judeo-Christian ideals of divine law, and consequently the practice of common law subordinates the characteristic, explicitly denying that traits, dispositions, and characteristics are what define a person. It's linked with religious ideas of what is authentically a human being, and of course, forgiveness. However, the human rights conceptualization holds the primary method of defining a person is not the humanity they share with all sons of Eve and daughters of Adam, but the traits and characteristics that possess that person. Now, this intellectual sleight of hand must result in a rearrangement of legal perception. Interpreting things through the lens of human rights divides us into tribes and creates a caste system of those tribes. Different characteristics have varying oppression ratings. There is an oppression hierarchy. There must be. Because the characteristic takes precedent and defines the person, it's a logical consequence that some people are more equal than others. Because of this foundational difference, the rights regime has a completely different definition of what a criminal is, what protections and rights mean, and limitations on who should be afforded protection and rights. Our traditional courts, with its precedents, relatively clear law, well-established interpretive principles, is adversarial, comparatively transparent, and treats people as individuals. In contrast, human rights laws are ambiguous. Interpretation is subjective, facilitating convenient application to approved collective identities. It refers to humans and people only as members of collectives. Yet both systems claim to administer justice. The House of Justice is divided against itself and in conflict. The human rights interpretive lens views Tickle versus Giggle, other cases mentioned relying on collectivist human rights principles like love, and two-tiered race-based justice administration as the very epitome of justness. Besides prohibiting certain behaviour, well-written, properly administrated laws limit when authority can act on individual citizens. The British common law system, with its high standards of proof, presumption of innocence, limits on what is admissible evidence, rights to silence, and adversarial rather than administrative nature stand in the way of woke activists. Now with Tickle versus Giggle, the insanity of trans ideology has been legally validated. All the foundational principles of diversity, inclusion, and equity have now been validated by the highest courts, who are not subject to democratic correction. Those judgments undermined the trust of the traditional courts in the minds of people like me who want to support common law systems. I've come to the unfortunate conclusion that it's necessary to believe what the woke say. It isn't just rhetoric when they label anyone who doesn't agree with them as Nazi reactionaries who are criminal threats to social cohesion. They believe they are on the side of right, and this justifies all of their actions. Believe them when they say that they want to decolonise justice administration, which means discarding the foundational principles and assumptions of common law and replacing them with something new. The woke progressives are correct in their perception that British common law, with its accountability, transparency, checks and balances on state power, stands in the way. Removal of common law protections of citizens would enable the effective weaponisation of justice administration against the opponents of progressive ideology. In their minds, it's right and just that so-called trans-exclusionary radical feminists like Sal Grover or other reactionary deplorables are bullied through process, forced to be re-educated, lose their ability to participate in society, and eventually may even be locked up. It's no coincidence that it was a human rights issue that brought Dr. Jordan Peterson to fame. It was his refusal to use pronouns when mandated by Human Rights Law Bill C-16 in Canada that launched him into world consciousness.
Bill C-16 purported to do nothing but extend human rights provisions to an excluded group, let's say, to the transgender and non-gender binary types, and that was the federal legislation. What's happened there is the government has introduced compelled speech legislation into the private sphere. It's never happened in the history of English common law. And so I said, there's no way I'm abiding by that. I don't care what your damn rationale is. We're compassionate. It's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're playing this radical collectivist left-wing game. You're trying to gain linguistic supremacy in the area of public discourse. You're doing that using compassion as a guise, and you're pulling the wool over people's eyes. And you're not going to do it with me.
If it wasn't for this human rights issue, there is no way that a comparatively unknown professor in Canada would have shot to international fame. There is something going on here. There is a reason why human rights regimes and international UN laws appeal so much to senior judges, especially those on federal and high courts. The appeal to high principles are above politics. They are informed by global values, enacting United Nations declarations which transcends the nation state or the Commonwealth. It's no coincidence that unelected, unaccountable judges want to cede yet more authority and power to global institutions. That way, the laws and institutions are safe from electoral cycles. Many of these laws and practices were introduced by stealth and practiced away from the public. Human rights tribunals are administrative and secretive. They work under cloaks of privacy, shielded from accountability and democratic correction. Sel herself made this observation.
There are some people who don't want to be or present as their sex. Okay, that's fine. Then there needs to be protections specifically for those people. But those protections cannot be at the expense of other people. Like, if this whole discussion had been that we want to have protections for trans women and trans men, okay.
Yeah.
Fine. But you can't even suggest that now without being accused of othering. And you're like, I'm not othering. I'm saying that I'm not othering in any way, like how saying that women need bathrooms separate from men are othering. You know, it's just, no, I'm saying that there's specific needs here. And let's recognize those specific needs. But instead of doing that in law, they just tried to punch it in and not go to any referendums, any plebiscites or anything like that. There's no mandates for these laws. That's the craziest thing.
Yeah.
Most people don't know that they've happened.
Yeah. I do recommend that interview, and there are some great short edits there as well. The Lioness Selgrover, with the excellent Kath Deeds, her lawyer, have indicated the recent decision will be appealed. They hope the High Court will apply precedents, accepted methods of interpretation, and common understanding of the meanings of words like woman. But the High Court is full of ideological appointments who will impose a human rights regime. Those magnificent women are fighting in a completely new field of play. They're not the courts that we knew and owned. The interpretation of hazy, subjective principles has resulted in the courts becoming a chimera that changes shape depending on what legal method, reasoning, or principles are being used. Unfortunately, I suspect the High Court will find a way to do what it wants to do. It sounds counterinstinctive to say, but human rights are the greatest threat to individual liberty in Australia today. The invocation of human rights is a powerful weapon because distortion of language and deceptive application of concepts makes it hard to identify, articulate, and therefore confront the threat. The halo effect of the invocation of human rights has protected human rights laws and the institutions enforcing them from serious scrutiny. All of us, me included, are in favour of people having liberty, but unfortunately it appears that people possessing liberty and human rights, at least as practiced, defined and categorised now, are mutually exclusive. And a big thanks to Kev for the comments. Fantastic book that Kev has recommended up there. Kev said, look this book up, I've put it on there, the hyperlink is there. And mate, yeah, look, I could not agree more with all the stuff you said. And thank you, of course, for coming on that interview. It was one of the, I don't want to make my other guests jealous, but I found that one of the most interesting and informative interviews that I've done ever, Kev. So big thanks to you. Big thanks to the other people that are commenting and liking as well. And everyone who's involved in this really, it sounds obtuse and it sounds deep and it sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty simple when it comes right down to it. Like I said, really human rights do not protect people. Human rights protect characteristics. Human rights don't see people as possessing characteristics. They see characteristics as possessing people. That's an upside down inversion of what's going on. And once you understand that really simple concept, it just puts absolutely everything into place and helps you understand that human rights and human liberty, well, at least human rights as they're practiced now and human liberty as we used to understand it are mutually exclusive. Thanks so much, Kev. Thanks so much, everybody else. Please like, please share, especially Kev, I'm talking to you, especially on your platform because more people watch you than they watch me, Kev. It kills me, but it's true. And other people who are watching as well, make sure you do that. Thanks, guys. See you all next week.